Welcome back to the Legit Culinary Think Tank. Alright, today we're going to be creating a baseline competition recipe from an existing recipe. There's 3 methods that I go about acquiring a recipe to start a baseline. The first is working with an existing recipe. The second is utilizing a ratio. And the third is working from scratch. After I determine my recipe source, I go through a process of what I call the Keogh method. And that is a process, it's a 9-step process that helps us identify exactly what we're using in a recipe, from oil all the way down to the smallest quantities of salt, pepper, or any other seasoning that might go into it. All right, so here's how we're going to pull a baseline competition recipe from an existing recipe. My first step is I'm going to find 2 recipes that are close to what I'm looking for. One very simple, very basic. Sherry vinaigrette is what we're going to make. So sherry vinegar is obviously the key vinegar in both of these vinaigrettes. This hazelnut sherry vinaigrette recipe I have has a few more embellishments to it. Hazelnut oil, honey, shallots, and it just kind of helps me think through, looking forward, additional flavors that I could add. So this first recipe, it's got 200 milliliters of sherry vinegar, and 200 milliliters is really close to 200 grams. So we're just going to make that conversion now. We're going to use the Dijon mustard. We're not going to use extra virgin olive oil because I want it to be neutrally flavored. And instead of grapeseed oil, we're going to use the Colorado Mills sunflower seed oil, which is beautiful, neutral, and it's going to take the place of this really, really well. So the full volume of oil that we'll need is 850 grams of oil. Keep the Dijon. And then looking over here for some of the embellishments, I think we're going to add a little bit of honey to this, but that's all going to be added to taste. Lemon juice, salt, pepper, and we may use water to thin it out. So that's the first step. We bring our first set of ingredients over. We have a base recipe here. We want to do a little math. This is going to make right around 1050 grams, so that's a little bit more than a liter. I don't need a liter of vinaigrette. We're going to get that closer to right around 250 grams. Pull out the calculator, right? 1050. So we're going to convert this recipe to be 25% of this initial quantity, right? So we're going to multiply these ingredients times 0.25 to get us down to a 25% batch. That's 212. We're going to make that 215 just to make it a little bit easier to work with. So rounding, right? Again, we're still going to adjust this to taste, and this is the baseline, so it's okay if we're doing that now. Now from here, we move it over to my next sheet. This is something I've developed for recipe development. And this is just a translation of all of these ingredients to this sheet. All right, now, as we start developing this recipe, the quantities that are already determined, right? The sherry vinegar, 50 grams here, oil, sunflower here, that's 215 grams already scaled out. Now the key to this process is making sure that everything we use helps us determine a quantity. This tray here hasn't been weighed yet. Everything that's on this tray gets weighed. So now we have salt. Our initial quantity of salt, including the container, is 254 grams. Yes, weigh the lemon. And then since we're trying to dial in this recipe, no details too small. All right, so now we're going to make the recipe. We're going to cook this dish just exactly as we would if we were just cooking and not following a recipe. Okay. Now, As part of this method, I'm just gonna season this and taste it to get it exactly where I want it, and then we'll scale the ingredients afterwards to see exactly what we used. Need a little bit more salt. And then I'm gonna add a little bit more pepper. And then I do need a little bit of sweetness from the honey, and since I didn't scale it initially, I need to go back and I need to scale that now. Sherry vinegar. But that's exactly what I'm looking for in my base vinaigrette. So again, baseline recipe. This is where we're starting. So we have our vinaigrette made. Now is the point when we can take a lot of data, right? I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna scale that recipe to make sure I know what the yield is. And that gives me a baseline quantity. And then we're gonna go back through and we're gonna scale all of these containers for the final quantity, and then we'll do a little bit of math to figure out what we used in order to develop that recipe. Zero out the scale. All right, so now we're just recording what the weight of this item is, everything that's on this tray. Right, now we go back through, do a little bit of math. So the initial weight that we started with on mustard, including the container, was 20 grams. We have 8.53 grams left. So we used 11.47 grams in the recipe. Round that up to 11.5. Honey. Vessel and everything inside, 607 grams. After we add to taste, we end up at 602. Which means we used 5 grams in the recipe. When you're using ingredients like pepper or cayenne, it's really important to use the microgram scale. You find yourself at 0.34 grams. With things like pepper, with things like cayenne, with spices, it's so critically important to make sure that you're really getting those ingredients right on the money. So 0.34 grams is a very ideal measurement for pepper when you're scaling a recipe. Didn't use water. Now I have a column over here on my paper which is order for use, right? And that helps me lay out my method nice and easily. So the first thing in the bowl was the sherry vinegar, so that's the first thing. And then I added the Dijon mustard. I added honey late, but that should actually go in with the mustard, so that's the third thing in the bowl. The oil was next, right? And then we had the lemon juice, the salt, the pepper, and we didn't use the water. So when I write my method now, I know that I can easily call back to the ingredients that I used. And then when I write the recipe with the ingredients, I can write them in the order of use in the recipe. That's the way it should be. If you write a recipe with the ingredients in order of how you use them, you will find a lot less error. Accuracy is a variable you can control in this environment, and the more variables you control, the more successful you will be. It's important to remember that everything is a process. Once the recipe is written, it's critical to have the discipline to follow that recipe. Next time that recipe is made, that recipe needs to be followed. And any changes, diversions, adjustments, they need to be noted on that recipe, and then the recipe evolves. It's critical to have that recorded process and that baseline so that you can have that reproducibility of a recipe. The key to any successful recipe is reproducibility. And in a competition environment, when you get to the final show, what it is an execution. You need to know your recipes are dialed in, you need to know they're gonna work, and this is one of those critical steps that's gonna get you to the point where you can have confidence in the reproducibility and that your recipes work. kill it. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel or check out my Instagram, Gerald L. Ford, and take a look. Thank you.